I think I mentioned when I was listing some of the logicians that you're interested in, Peirce's name, but Charles Sanders Peirce, he's come up on the show. His name, at least, has been invoked many times, but his work, I think it only came up in an episode with Gabe Greenberg of UCLA where we were talking about icons and symbols. And what was the third one? Indexicals?
Icons, indexes, and symbols. Indices and symbols.
Indices, yeah. And I know that Peirce is a particularly important figure for you, though not just because of algebraic logic, his role in early algebraic logic. But before we get into his work, just who was he? When was he around?
When was he around? So he was an American philosopher, one of the sort of triad of American pragmatist philosophers, along with William James and John Dewey. So those are the three figures who are kind of associated with the movement in philosophy that's called American pragmatism. Most of his work was produced, I would say, between 1870 and 1910. There's sort of different stages in his writing. So if you look at his writings from like the 1870s, they tend to be mostly technical writings. When he's developed, as you mentioned, he's like sort of advancing algebraic logic beyond the state at which it had been developed by George Boole 20 years earlier, expanding it to include sort of his great real achievement was to sort of expand Boole's logic beyond simple monadic predicates to encompass two-place relations and three-place relations as well. So he developed an algebraic logic of relations,
which is vital to today's mathematics.
It's fascinating, yeah. I mean, it's not quite so. The system that he developed in the 1870s, it's now known to be equivalent to a certain fragment of first-order quantificational logic. It's not exactly as strong as first-order quantificational logic, but it's equivalent to first-order quantificational logic with two variables. So it's a large fragment of first-order logic. Interestingly enough, Peirce himself, in the 1880s, sort of pivoted away from the algebraic approach towards a quantificational approach to logic. And he developed a system of quantificational logic, which we now know to be equivalent to first-order quantificational predicate logic. And in fact, the kind of notation that we use when we teach, say, quantifier logic to students, like predicate logic to students, is Peirce's notation. It's not Frege's. So the backwards E for the existential quantifier and the upside down A for the universal quantifier. So that's Peirce's notation.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah. And so it's interesting. So he was really doing sort of logic in a very like state of the art way. He's a very interesting and tragic figure. I don't want to get too much into his biography because it would just take up too much of our time.
But now that you said he's tragic, I've got to hear.
So he grew up in he was sort of raised in this intellectual environment that was probably about as kind of purely academic an environment as like one can imagine. So he was raised in sort of Cambridge. His father, Benjamin Peirce,
Massachusetts.
Cambridge, Massachusetts. Sorry, his father. So he was a kind of a child of Harvard, so to speak. Although his relationship with the university is very fraught, but his father, Benjamin Peirce, was a really well-known and quite preeminent mathematician, probably America's best mathematician at the time. And so Peirce was surrounded by, like as a child, he was surrounded by like all of these intellectuals who were. So at the time, Cambridge was a very rich place because they were basically living off of this. This was the time when the center of commerce in America hadn't yet moved to Wall Street. It was State Street or whatever I think it is in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time. So these were all the people who were kind of living fat off of the money that had been made in the East India trade. And so they had nothing to do. They had lots of money and they had nothing to do but sit around and kind of like speculate and theorize and be intellectuals. They were academics in like a real sense of the term. And so Peirce grew up in that environment, in a very like kind of thick academic environment, a very thick academic setting, surrounded by people who were kind of really deeply intellectual in their orientation. And so he grew up in that environment. He was a bit of a kind of savant in his own way. He was very gifted in mathematics, especially in logic. He had a lot of very interesting insights early on. He was really a sort of early student of philosophy. He read Kant at a very early age. It had a very deep impact on him. He thought about Kant in kind of philosopher's terms. So he understood all the Kantian jargon. He was kind of a traditional philosopher in that sense of the term. He was familiar with the various traditions in philosophy that were being discussed and debated. He knew all of the major works in like the German idealist tradition. He was like deeply kind of invested in all of that stuff. At the same time, he was also, he had his feet in the world of what was then sort of hard experimental science. So he spent most of his career not working as a philosopher in an academic program, although that would have been his dream, I'm sure. But for various reasons, he wasn't allowed to hold positions like that. But he spent most of his career working for the U.S. Coastal Survey, I think. And basically, this was like hard science, right? Basically, he was a scientist, and he made some important contributions to the theory of like pendular motion, right? He basically argued that all of the pendula that were being used to measure positions were subject to a certain systematic error that needed to be corrected, right? And he worked out this whole account of the errors that were present in all these pendular measurements, and he figured out a way to kind of correct for those errors in a kind of systematic way. It was very like, it's very like boots on the ground, non-theoretical, empirical, experimental science. And he spent a lot of his time doing that, although he really wasn't well suited for the work because it was like very detail oriented. It was very meticulous. And he was a bit of a, how do I put it? He was a bit of an intellectual wanderer. His mind went to all sorts of different places, and he wrote about all sorts of different things. And so he had a lot of difficulty like holding that job. He also had a really, as far as reports go, he had a really like irascible personality, like a really irascible temperament. He was disliked by a lot of people, like personally disliked for a variety of reasons. He was regarded as a very difficult personality to deal with. Some people think it was in part owing to the fact that that he suffered from a kind of debilitating case of facial neuralgia. So what would happen is he would undergo these kind of like paralytic experiences where his face would just like freeze up, and it would cause him a great deal. He would be in excruciating pain during this time, and so to medicate himself, he used all sorts of drugs, and he sort of became addicted to many of the drugs that he was using, largely like to medicate himself. And that compounded his like personal difficulties with people. He was also somebody who wasn't, how do I put it? He wasn't particularly moved by like the contemporary moral strictures of his day. He lived a kind of like not extravagant life, but he lived kind of like what would be regarded as a sort of morally borderline sketchy life, let's say.
He's a debaucherous guy.
He was. And so he had a lot of difficulty securing permanent academic positions, even though he was, in his own way, a quite famous figure, So like William James and John Dewey were both students of his. They attended lectures that he gave. And William James was actually a close friend of his and tried to sort of petition on his behalf to get him an appointment at a university. And it couldn't happen because the higher ups in the administration just vetoed it. And so he never ended up holding any permanent academic position. He did manage to hold a kind of temporary academic position at Johns Hopkins when it first started up its graduate program, where he taught logic, and there's a collection of lectures that he delivered along with published articles by students who worked with him in that period of time that's available, and that is really like incredible. So the work that they produced in that period of time is really like remarkable. But he was never able to secure a permanent academic position, which is a real shame. And so he ended up dying pretty much broke and living off of the charity of a few of his kind of patrons who, kept him going. He had a lot of like failed business ventures and like things that he tried that never like worked out. And so, what's really disappointing, when I say tragic, what's really disappointing is that when he died, I guess this was I'm sorry, I'm going to mess the year up. It's sometime between 1910 and 1915. I don't know. When he died, all of his papers, and he was one of these people who wrote voluminously. So, his collected works, which are now being put together, are probably going to, exceed something like 30 volumes when they're all put out. So he has these. He all of his collected papers were kept sort of under lock and key at Harvard, but for a variety of really unfortunate reasons, they were never open to the public. And it was like 50 years later that some of his like former students managed to get the papers released. So, for like half a century, we were deprived of all of this like incredible scholarship. And it was because of, it's because of like the prudishness of American academia. It's because they were afraid that some of his letters would reveal, I don't know, personal things that Harvard didn't want to be associated with. It's one of like, it's one of these like, it highlights, what can go so terribly wrong with these academic institutions, right? That they can be like so conservative in their attitude towards these things. It's a real tragedy from the point of view of like American philosophy, because we lost this person's work, who was probably, to my mind at least, one of the most original philosophers of all time. Certainly one of the most original American philosophers. And we just didn't have access to his work for 50 years because, the prudes at Harvard didn't want us to be offended by something that would come up in one of his letters or something. It's just a shame. Anyway, there's more on his life. He hasn't actually been in my opinion, he hasn't actually been properly biographized. So like, there aren't biographies that one can read of him, I think, that are as carefully. There are a few that are okay, but I don't think there's like a definitive biography of Peirce. It's still waiting to be written. Partly it's because partly because his work is so difficult to digest. He's not an easy philosopher to read, and in fact,
he's making up new words every. Yeah,
paragraph. He's a philosopher's. He's. What's funny is like what most people know Peirce for, is a series of essays that he wrote on the methodology of science. Right. So these are famous papers that people will often read in courses on pragmatism or even courses on the philosophy of science. And, they always begin with this famous paper called The Fixation of Belief. That's the first paper in the series. And then they move on to the second paper, which is called How to Make Our Ideas Clear. And it's in that paper that Peirce famously introduces what William James later describes as like the pragmatic maxim for meaning. This is the way that meaning is to be determined, right? By considering what its observable outcomes are. And so he introduces that as part of his like series of essays on the methodology of science. People usually stop after reading those first two essays, but actually the rest of the essays get really interesting because the third essay is on probability. I think it's called The Doctrine of Chances. The fourth essay is a theory of statistics, like a general theory of probable inference, if I'm remembering correctly. That's a paper in which Peirce introduces for the first time the notion of a p-value in statistics. Never been discussed before. And it's really a p-value. He computes them. He presents them as part of his theory of statistical inference. And this is like years before Neyman and Pearson came along. And, presented all this stuff in kind of systematic fashion. And so it's like, it's really remarkable stuff. But those essays on the methodology of science, which people kind of do associate with Peirce, they were papers that Peirce wrote only because he was completely broke and he needed money. And the publisher of this journal on popular science or something asked him if he would be willing to write a series on the, on the methodology of science. And so he agreed. And so he published these papers, which I'm sure for that venue, whatever the venue, it was like popular science, right? I'm sure for that venue, these papers were like way too philosophical, probably for the intended audience. But they really are Peirce at his like least technical. They're Peirce at his like, this is where Peirce is really trying to be accessible. Later on, when he was afforded like sort of more license to write philosophy in the form that he wanted to write it in, the philosophy becomes much more esoteric. It becomes much more like technical and jargon filled. And you see that he really is like, he's a philosopher in that sense of the term. You know, he's a systematic architectonic philosopher in that sense of the term, where, you know, he feels like all the terminology is wrong and we just have to reintroduce it from scratch. So there's that, you know, there's that part of his corpus that people read. The other part of his corpus that has become really popular is his work on semiotics, the theory of signs. That's popular among linguists now. I think it was popular for a while among sort of analytic anthropologists. They really like a lot of Peirce's work, and so Peirce has become popular in those crowds. I think his, you know, he hasn't fully been revived in mainstream academic philosophy, and so that's something that we're still waiting for. But he will be eventually. The work is original enough that it'll stand the test of time, and he does in fact develop, like he has a system of philosophy which is interestingly and importantly different from other systems of philosophy that we study. So that's Peirce. I mean, I got into Peirce myself, not so much by reading his philosophy. I only came to that sort of later because it's just like more obscure. It's less accessible.